In the last video, we talked about using some of the auto features from Premiere that the Adobe gods have decided should now be considered obsolete. And now we're going to talk about what Premiere, or perhaps it's the Adobe gods, really want you to be using. And that is the Lumitri color. So I still have my Lumitri scopes open. And remember, I got to that from Window, Lumitri scopes, and then I clicked on the wrench to choose RGB Parade, RGB, and Waveform Luma, and then to get them both side by side, I clicked both of them here. And now I'm going to go up to Window and choose Lumitri Color. And that generally appears over here on the right-hand side if you are in the editing mode. If you're in the color or effects mode, you could have a different layout. So there are several panels here, and they're all condensed initially. So I'm going to start with opening up Basic Correction. And under basic correction, I have my option for white balance and my tones, and I also have an auto feature. So I'm going to choose a different clip here. I'm going to work on this one. So this also has an auto feature that you may want to try out. I'm going to click on this initially, auto, and we can see that it made some adjustments here. It adjusted both the tone and the colors of my clip. But if we look at the RGB color scope here, I still have too much red. So it did a pretty good job just on the auto. But if I want to see what that looked like without it, I can go back to reset. And we can talk about how we can go in and individually change these things. So let's also go up to white balance. With white balance, because I do like to set my white balance before I even get into these things, I'm going to click on the eyedropper, and then I'm going to click on some part of my clip that needs to be completely white. So if you don't have that in your clip, it won't work. But I think the highlight of this cup should be completely white. So I'm going to click on that, and we can see that actually did a pretty good job of correcting my RGB. So this one brought the blue up higher and the red down lower than I got from my auto. I'm still kind of flatlined in my tones over here. I don't have a lot that's pumping up to the highlights or a lot that's going down to the shadows. Everything's kind of in the midtones. So that's something else I'd want to keep working on. Now if I go over to my tones, let's just take a look at what all of these do. My exposure is going to make everything darker or brighter. I'm going to reset that back. The contrast, so perhaps this is what I want to work with here. I could make my highlights brighter and my shadows darker. And as I do that, you do see that over here in my tone value representation, that it is expanding more. I'm not quite as flat lined. This is the way it was before, if you look. And now I can kind of pump that up. If I wanted, instead of making my shadows darker and my highlights brighter, if I wanted to target those things separately, I could. So I'm going to bring this back down. I'll just reset. And now I'll do it separately. I'll go into my highlights and I'll bring the highlights up, and notice how the shadows are staying here. Bring the highlights up. It's a bit much. And I can bring the shadows down, and again, see how in here it's just affecting the shadows, not the highlights. So that's kind of cool as well. So it's basically going into the contrast in doing the two parts, the shadows and the highlights, individually. The whites, if I wanted to get my whites brighter on their own, I could go in and just affect the whites, and it's not affecting the shadows. And the same thing here, if I wanted to lighten up the dark areas or darken the dark areas without it affecting the whites, I could do those separately. So you could start with your auto feature here, see if you like it. If not, reset and then go into the individuals. And then also white balance is a really good starting point. Just take your eyedropper, click into something that's white, and see how that sets your RGB and your tone values. Tint, most of the time you're not going to need unless it's for an effect, but this will literally make things cooler, everything cooler or everything warmer. So I'm going to actually remove all of this so that we can now do it with the curves. I'm going to go back to my my effects control. And it's just taking a second to load. Where'd my effects control go? Go back here, effects control, my clip. All right. I don't know why it wasn't loading. And here it is in Lumitri color. So it applies it, or it sets itself up in effects control just as if I applied an effect here. And I'm going to click on it and I want to delete it. So I just hit delete on my keyboard. And I'm going to close basic correction. So just clicking on this to close it. And instead I'm going to go down to curves. And I can do pretty much everything I did in basic correction in curves. So I have the white, and that represents all of my tones, what would affect over here. And then I have the individual red, green, and blue. So normally the first thing you want to do is go into the white to affect the tones if there needs to be some color correction. So I need to expand. I need to get a little bit more into the shadows and a little bit more up into the highlights because I really don't have anything up in 0. So the way this line works is if I grab the top part and I move it to the left, that's increasing my highlights. You can look over here and you can see how it pumped that up. Now I have sections more going towards 100. If I clicked in the middle, I could create an anchor point, and if whichever direction I drag that, you can see if I drag it to the left, I'm getting more highlights. If I drag to the right in the midtones, I'm getting those to be more shadows. I'm going to leave those kind of in the middle. And I grab the bottom point, or I make a new anchor point down here and I drag that up, I am decreasing my shadows. So I'm making my image flatter, which I don't really want. Or if I move it to the right, then I am increasing my shadows. I'm making them darker. You can see I really have a lot of contrast now, which might be a cool effect. You might like that. But if I just want to make a little bit more contrast, I'm just going to move it out a small amount. So after you've done that, I'm going to just move this back here, and you're satisfied with how your waveform looks in terms of tones. You have ranges going up to 100 and you have some down at 0. Then you can move over to the colors and do your color correction. So when I look at my RGB, I see I have too much red and too little blue. So, and it's in the highlights. I could get a little bit more red in the shadow, but it's mostly what I'm seeing is the problem is in the highlights. So I'm going to go to my red and I'm going to work on my highlights. So I'm going to grab the highlights for the red and I'm going to drag them down a little bit, and I'm watching how in my RGB parade it's lowering itself, and I can see it getting cooler over here. And I'm going to kind of stop. I'm looking here, but I'm also looking at my monitor. And now I can go over into my blues, and I need to increase that in the highlights or the midtone, top part of the midtones. So I could just grab the top part and move that to the left to increase it. Or if I don't want to do just the highlights, I could make an anchor point. So this would be like the very brightest spots of my blues. So I can make an anchor point a little before, and you see how it drags more of the midtone up. And now that looks a lot more neutral. If I want to see the way it looked before, I can go back to my effects control and I can just hit the FX. So I toggle that off. And now I can see it was a lot warmer and flatter. And now it has a lot more pump and it's a lot more neutral looking. All right, I'm going to close up the curves. The other things that we have here that could be interesting are mostly for creative. So under creative, if you wanted to give it a faded film look, it has like an old look added to it, you could apply that. Or if you wanted to sharpen it, you wanted to increase the color concentration, so vibrance or saturation, you could do all those things here. So these are more the things that you would do after you have corrected it. And the same thing for vignetting. Vignetting is the effect where you could kind of fade the edges. I'm actually going to pick a different clip to do this. I'll put my, click on the house clip outside. It's taking a second to load it. So depending on which direction I go, if I go to the right or the left, I get a different color of vignetting, whether it's white or it's black. I'm going to move it all the way to the left and move my midpoint all the way, to the left as well. And you can see I get a very dark vignetting. So basically it just makes this almost like eye around it. It shadows the edges here. And then you could control the roundness of the circle that we see there and how soft the edges are. That's the feather. And if I go in the opposite direction, I get more of like a faded film on the edges. It's kind of goes to the white on the outside. I'm going to get rid of that one for a second. Got rid of that effect. And the last one I want to talk about over here is the color match. So let's say you have two clips that they should be side by side, and they look like they should be shot at the same time, but the color was slightly different in them. You can use the color match to try to help you match them. It does an okay job, but it's not perfect. So let's say, for example, I have this outside shot here, and it's shot at a later time of day than this one over here. I like the way this one looks. So I want to try to take this clip and match it to the other one. So I have this clip selected. I'm going to go to open up Color Wheels and Color Match and click on Comparison View. And so what that gives me is my original clip here and then my entire timeline over here. So here I want to scroll to find the clip that I want to match it to, and here it is. And then I'm going to apply match. I just click on apply match, and it tried to match. It applied the colors, tones, and RGB of what it found over here onto this one, and it does an okay job. So it might be a good starting point, and then after that you'd want to go in maybe under either basic color correction or curves, and you could tweak it more. The last thing I want to show you is an adjustment layer. You may be familiar with adjustment layers from Photoshop. It's the idea that you could apply your effects on a layer above all of your clips, and whatever that effect is would apply to all the clips underneath it. To apply the adjustment layer, or to create a new adjustment layer, we actually have to have our project pane selected. So over here, this one needs to be active. If not, it's grayed out. And then I go up to File, New, Adjustment Layer. So again, if you don't have that panel selected, this will be grayed out. And you can, most of the time, you're just going to say OK here because it's just asking if you want to have it set up to be the same size as your video. So you'd say OK. And now this has become its own clip over here in your project pane. And you can click and drag this out onto a top track, so above. You can extend its length, you can make it shorter, you could cut it, you could do whatever you want. Let's add an effect to it. I'm going to go to my effects panel and I'm going to search for tint. I already have that here actually. Just type in tint into the search, and then I'm going to double click it. I should turn off the comparison views, so I forgot to do that. I'm going to go back to my Lumitri color and click where it says comparison view, so I'm only seeing one at a time. Okay. So let's make sure I was on adjustment layer needs to be selected, and I'm going to double click tint. And now what it did is, by default, tint makes everything black and white. So if I scrub over all of the clips that have the adjustment layer over them, they've all been made black and white. I'm going to remap, so the tint will be more like a map. I'm going to remap my white to kind of like a sepia tone or so give it a little bit of warmth. So I'm just changing the value of my white to this color, and now you can see, now I'll lighten the amount of the tint a little bit so it's more like a sepia. Every single one of the clips underneath here has that tint applied to it. So this was just an example using a tint. You could do this with any one of the effects. Just make sure that you have the adjustment layer selected, you apply the effect, and then you can click and drag this out. I'll expand my timeline and have it affect all of the clips that are underneath. Okay, so have some fun with your adjustments and let me know if you have any questions.